In this next short lecture, we will talk about the contraction cycle, what takes place between actin and myosin and ATP. Let's take a look at what happens. Now, when you have more ATP, when you have more ATP than the body needs at any given time, the body can take one of these phosphates and put it in storage. So then you don't have adenosine triphosphate, right? If you're removing one, then you have adenosine diphosphate. You have ATP plus this phosphate is going to be stored with creatine. We'll call it creatine phosphate. The body doesn't like to have lots of ATP in storage, so it just breaks it down. It's going to keep ADP and creatine phosphate next to each other. And when the body needs to, the ADP can connect with this phosphate and convert us back to ATP if it needs to. All right, so that's why in this picture here you see ADP plus this other P, this phosphate, or you can think of it as CP, creatine phosphate, same thing. In the green we have actin. We can see we have that string, the tropomyosin and troponin, and we can see that here the binding sites are exposed. Now what happens at how did the binding sites become exposed? Well, look what we have here. We got calcium. So calcium plucked out the troponin and the tropomyosin shifted. So what happened? The myosin magnetically connected to the binding site and the head made contact. Now look what happens to the ADP and P. Because remember, we need ATP to detach the muscle. So here we have ADP and that phosphate still associated with that cross bridge. Now look what happened to the myosin head. From here to step 2, it bent. It bent and it created a contraction. It slid the muscle. They call it a power stroke. It actually moved the muscle. But now this head here needs to detach to only grab on again. Okay, so the ADP and the creatine phosphate is released from the myosin head. When they release, it forms ATP. ATP attaches to the myosin and the myosin head detaches. So we need energy for the detachment. Okay, and then when it detaches, this whole cycle can happen again over and over and over again, right? It's kind of like having a tug of war. Like when you're pulling on a rope, both your hands are on the rope, and when you pull the rope to you, you then have to release one of your hands to move it in front of the other again. And then you have to release the other hand to put it on the rope again and pull again. So each time you're detaching your hand from the rope, that's equivalent to your myosin head detaching from actin, and that requires ATP. So let's take a look at this muscle metabolism, right? We already mentioned creatine phosphate before. We have anaerobic glycolysis, and we have cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is the Krebs cycle. Anaerobic glycolysis means glycolysis. Lysis means to break down. Now remember, glucose is a 6-carbon sugar. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6-carbon sugar. So when you split this in half, that's glycolysis. Okay, you don't need oxygen for that to happen. That's why it's called anaerobic. And then you're left with this. You're left with 2 3 carbon sugars. Okay, that's called pyruvate or pyruvic acid. It's another type of sugar. Creatine phosphate, that's the CP. That's what we showed you before when you have ADP plus that P, that other phosphate, it's really CP, creatine phosphate. So let's take a look here. We have ATP, and when you have too much ATP, your body can break that down into ADP and creatine phosphate. Now you can have creatine phosphate joining with ADP to produce ATP, right? It's a cycle. It can be made and broken, made and broken. So creatine kinase, again, we see ACE as an enzyme. Creatine kinase catalyzes the transfer of phosphate group from creatine phosphate to ADP. That's called creatine kinase. Okay. Now, this energy is used fast. The creatine phosphate, the duration of that energy, it gives you about 50, it's like a power lift, right? Creatine phosphate gives you immediate energy for a quick power lift, and that's about it, okay? That's about it. So at rest, a muscle produces more ATP than it needs. So the ATP will transfer its energy to creatine. So that's where we have ATP is going to transfer some of this P to creatine. So you get one less phosphate than ATP, which gives you ADP, adenosine diphosphate. And then creatine and phosphate come together, giving you CP. Okay, and during each contraction, the myosin head breaks down ATP, producing the ADP and the phosphate, right? So we look at this, can go from ADP, adenosine diphosphate, plus CP, creatine phosphate, using the creatine kinase enzyme, can create ATP plus creatine. Okay, because this phosphate's going to join here, going from a diphosphate to a triphosphate. And CPK is the enzyme that does that, creatine phosphokinase. CPK can cross the cell membrane and is released into the bloodstream also when muscle is damaged. So if this is a muscle, let's say a cardiac muscle cell, and you have CPK in there, this enzyme, if this ruptures and opens up and CPK leaches out, the amount of CPK in your bloodstream goes up. And this is when muscle cells are breaking down. So someone can have a massive heart attack. Muscle cells are breaking down. They can tell by measuring the CPK enzymes in the blood. Also, rhabdomyolysis. If someone's doing some, I had a patient about 4 years ago that was doing CrossFit, and you know, CrossFit's amazing. It could do wonders for people, but if you don't know how to do it smart and you don't train properly, it can send you in a downward spiral where you'll be urinating black, and your kidneys will start to break down, your muscles will start to break down. It's called rhabdomyolysis. It's very, very dangerous and happens to people. Now let me show you glycolysis and the Krebs cycle. So in the cell, we have mitochondria. That's what this large thing here is, the mitochondria. And the mitochondria is surrounded by all the other organelles like the nucleus and the Golgi apparatus, and it's in the cytosol. Okay, so glucose can be broken down. Remember, glucose was that 6 carbon sugar, can be broken down if we split that into 2 3 carbon sugars. That's called pyruvic acid. So if you can do that, that's called glycolysis. That takes place in the cytoplasm or the cytosol, and you don't need oxygen for that to take place. Now, if oxygen is available, right? You're not huffing and puffing from exercise. You're in a pretty good relaxed state, exercising moderately. Pyruvic acid can go into the mitochondria and it can enter the Krebs cycle. And the Krebs cycle can produce ATP. So does glycolysis, but glycolysis doesn't produce a lot of energy. The Krebs cycle produces some ATP, but not lots. It makes these coenzymes that are used by the electron transport chain. This is what produces the big bucks. This produces ATP, lots of ATP. Okay, some say 34 ATP, some say 36, but it produces lots of ATP, this electron transport chain. Now, the Krebs cycle needs your B vitamins, B1, B2, B3. It needs your B vitamins. And the electron transport chain needs iron. You ever wonder why, if you're iron deficient or you have an iron deficiency anemia, that you don't produce a lot of ATP and you get tired and you're fatigued? You ever wonder during menstruation, when a woman is menstruating, she may not have all the energy in the world, because if you're losing blood, you're losing iron. If you're losing iron, you're losing the ability to produce ATP. The electron transport chain also uses CoQ10, coenzyme Q10. Okay, coenzyme Q10. We'll talk a little bit more about that when I mention and we get into cholesterol medication. Okay, and I think I'll talk about that in this slide here. Let's take a break and we'll come back.